All right, well, welcome to those who are interested in starting the process to work on an NIH grant. And this is geared really towards CPIP affiliates who might not have had experience submitting grants to NIH, especially those who are interested in working in demography, population health, population sciences. And this will also be recorded and posted on the CPIP website for those who want it to review various slides. So I wanted to give you a brief outline about how things are going to work. First, I'm going to describe briefly why you would think of submitting a grant to NIH into the Pop Dynamics branch. Especially the question I often get is, well, my work doesn't really involve a ton of health outcomes, so it's not healthy enough, and so maybe I won't submit there. I'll also talk about how you would match your grant application to the appropriate study section and agency. We'll talk about various grant mechanisms, and I'll give you a sense of the timeline from about 2 months out to the day of submission to start to hit some of those progress points. I'll end with some practical tips and resources, and then I'll turn it over to Candace Odgers and Greg Duncan for the second half of the hour, because they've spent time as study section reviewers on the NIH panel, and they have expert advice about some aspects to accentuate in the application and some pitfalls to avoid. So, and then we'll open it up to Q&A in the end. So that's the structure, and I'll just dive in. So why would your grant or your idea potentially be suitable to NIH and the population dynamics branch? Well, in looking at much of the work that CPIP faculty affiliates perform, the population dynamics branch is really exclusively devoted to a lot of the work that CPIP faculty do. You can look at the website, but also I put this detailed description because it's really inclusive in terms of the things that it would be interested in funding. So in particular, these are outcomes related to child health and development. So it begins in fertility and pregnancy, but then also extends to migration, population distribution, stratification, racial disparities, gender disparities, economic disparities, family demography, population growth, causes and consequences of demographic change. So it's actually, the charge of PDB is quite broad. And I would argue that much of the work that CPIP faculty are doing could plausibly fit, especially if it's into any potential health outcome under 25, into NICHD and Pop Dynamics branch. The priorities also listed under this Pop Dynamics branch, or PDB, are listed at the bottom of the slide. Health, disease, and development across the lifespan is one thing that I highlight. Again, this is pretty broad. So I think there could be a clear argument that's made for your research and its fit to NIH and NICHD in particular. So why NICHD? Well, the Institute of Child Health and Human Development, the funding line is around 12%. So only the top 12% of grants tend to get funded, but there's also good news, because if you're an early stage investigator, that is, you have your PhD within the last 10 years, the funding line gets bumped up, depending on the year, but generally up to 17%. And then also new investigators get a little bit of extra consideration. The new investigator is defined as someone who has no previous R01 grant as PI. Okay. And the other thing that I would say differentiates NIH from some other funding agencies is that you know who will evaluate your work, and they have names. And so these people give you feedback because they're your peers. So this contrasts starkly with, say, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I've always found that foundation to be very opaque in terms of how they review the grant, and they almost never give you feedback. So you have no idea if the grant met the funding priorities or if it wasn't a good scientific idea. And so there's not really that much academic discourse. This is very different than NIH. You tend to get feedback on a grant that, even if it's not funded, can set the groundwork for a better research agenda and for catalyzing collaboration across colleagues who you involved on the grant. Also, if your work doesn't relate specifically to child health and human development, You could also look at other NIH branches, such as National Institutes on Aging, NIA, and especially for Alzheimer's and dementia research, their funding line is almost around 30%. So that's almost 1 in 3 grants that are submitted to NIA to study Alzheimer's and dementia are funded, okay? So there's a real variation across branches and priorities in NIH as it leads to different funding lines. So it's worth keeping that in mind as you are considering whether your grant fits into which branch of NIH. So I'll continue to focus on NICHD mainly because one of the key reasons that CPIP is pushing towards a pop center grant from NIH is that there will be more money for scholars working on infant and child health and human development. And so that's why I'm focusing on it, because next year we plan to submit a new NIH Pop Center grant. So one way to start with looking at the fit of your grant with NICHD is get a sense of the grants that have already been successfully submitted and received. So here you have NIH Reporter, which really is a great resource. I give you the website and I'll walk you through what you can do. So here's the website NIH Reporter, and I decided to search for our dear colleague George Farkas in the quick search. Okay, so I just type his name in the quick search, and then I get a lot of information that is publicly available on the grants in which George is active. Okay, so you get on the project type on the left circle the name of the grant or the number, and if you click on that, you can get a summary of the entire grant. It's about 30 lines. It's very informative. On the right circle, you see the funding agency that in this case was NICHD. So you can see that his grants were funded by this agency, and you can later on determine the study section that reviewed the grant. Now, this, however, doesn't guarantee. So if you're reviewing other people's grants and you get a sense of the flavor of the grants that have been funded, I should say Reporter can be much more detailed. So you can not only do a quick search, but if you scroll to the bottom to advanced project search, you can be much more detailed in the searches that you conduct. But also, now that you might have honed that, okay, my idea can fit NICHD, how does it fit the study section that'll be most receptive to my idea? Okay, and I think this is a key part that many folks that submit outside of NIH but have limited experience in NIH don't get, which is that NIH doesn't actually really review the science of your grant. That's the study section. The study section is asked and convened by NIH to meet, but it's not NIH that is really scoring the science, okay? This is your peers that are volunteering. Usually they're peers who have already gotten an NIH grant at some point, and they're volunteering to review and score the science of your grant. So knowing the study section is critical, because really you need to convince the study section of the value of your idea and your proposal before NIH determines the funding line and who gets the money, okay? I would also say that knowing the study section tends to happen often with universities that invite speakers, and you notice, oh wow, look at all these guest speakers that come through. They tend to be people that are on study section or previously have been on study section, because, well, you want to get a sense of which way the wind is blowing in the study section. They're not allowed to talk about specific details, but clearly they have experience about serving on the section. So in terms of finding whether or not your grant idea could potentially fit with that study section, you want to make sure that it gets assigned to the right one. So NIH has a matchmaking app. It's wonderful. It's not like Tinder. It's not like Yenta in Fiddler on the Roof. That's the image for those of you that are music theater buffs. But you go to the Matchmaker website, and here's an example from work that I did. It was looking at older age survival and gender differences in older age survival. So I'll walk you through how Matchmaker works. So I'm showing you the same NIH Reporter page. This is identical to the page I showed you a few slides ago. However, the key difference is instead of searching for George Farkas on the quick search, I show you that orange circle around Matchmaker. Okay, so that's at the bottom right. And then I click on the Matchmaker to get started. And then I get to here. And again, I circled the Matchmaker part and I insert a description of my research. This is an abstract of what I'm proposing. Okay, and I insert that into Matchmaker and I click the search button. Okay, and what I get are grants that look kind of like the grant I submitted. Okay, I also get the institute to which grants that look like mine have been submitted before, the activity code, or that kind of middle set of bars like the light green, about what mechanism grants that look like mine have gone to. And then most critically, on the right, the study section to which grants that look like mine have gone. Okay, and this is where you really determine the match. All right, because what you would see, at least what I saw, is that social science and population studies branch A and B, or social science and population studies A and B, they're clones of each other. They're both very large study sections. If you add them together, they are the overwhelming majority of projects that are received that look like ones that I would plan to submit, at least for this question. Another thing to point out is that my grant related more to aging, and therefore the funding agency, if you look on the left set of bars where it says Institute and Center on the top left, the majority of grants are being channeled to National Institutes on Aging. So this would not, for example, fit the NICHD charge, but it would go to fit more NIA. Okay, so that's critical because let's say you write a summary and you are arguing or mentioning to the scientific review officer that you would like your grant to be reviewed by social scientists like you, but you put your summary into NIH Reporter and the study section that's recommended differs from SSPB and SSPA, they're going to have a really hard time justifying scientifically how to move your grant to be reviewed under SSPB and SSPA. Okay, so I would strongly urge you to use Matchmaker early so that you really get a sense of how your grant fits into the right study section. If alternatively it fits into another study section, that's fine too. It just wouldn't necessarily fall under the purview of the population dynamics branch. And we can discuss what that means. But you want, in general, people who review your grants to maybe have heard of your work or to be in the area that you're in. So who is in SSPA and SSPB? The study sections that are likely to match social science research and population dynamics research. Well, you can find that via the publicly available website as well on NIH. They review social, behavioral, economic applications focused on health and well-being across the life course, health disparities, demographic processes, economic and policy influences on health. Again, very broad, fits a social science faculty. The disciplines that are commonly represented in SSPA and SSPB: sociology, social epi, demography, econ, public health, geography, and human development and family studies. Again, quite broad. So here is the website that I would use to search who is on study section right now. So I go to the website that I alluded to in the previous slide. I type in at the top right, SSPA. That's it. Simple search. Okay. And then I get a list of who's on the roster. Now, they don't have the roster for the June meeting, but these are the names that I pulled from a mix of SSPA and SSPB. I pulled this not because this is going to be the same list as the one next year. They change often, but only to tell you that you might know a few of the names that are on here. Okay, these are not strangers to most of you. There are a lot of social scientists. There's a lot of sociologists. And so this is really to demystify the process, that it's not this group of others. there tends to be very limited degrees of separation between you, your work, and maybe people you interact with at conferences, or whose articles or grants you've reviewed yourself. In terms of the mechanism, so now we're at this point where you have identified that NIH is right for you. You have located that your grant might relate to NICHD and to matching it to a study section of peers that will likely understand what it is you're pitching. And then the question is, well, what are you actually going to write? Okay. There's a variety of mechanisms. I'm going to focus only on 3 today to make things digestible, but rest assured, if you want to write a training grant or some other thing, there's a lot more mechanisms, but these are the 3 main ones for research. And they are the R01, the R21, and the R03. The R01 is the big daddy. It's the high value grant. It's the most labor intensive to create, but ultimately is for the large projects. So you get direct costs funded around $500,000 a year. You can apply for more, but in general, that's the max. So it can be about $2.5 million in direct costs over 5 years. The R01 doesn't have to be 5 years long. I've seen R01s that are 3 to 4 years, but in general, they're 5 years. Now, the R01 is a very large application, but the good news to you is that the science, which is the specific aims and the research statement, by and large, is just 13 pages. 13 pages, single spaced. Okay. By contrast, the R21 is much less money. It's $275,000 direct total over 2 years. Okay. And the research, the specific aims and research statement is only 7 pages. And then you get to the R03, which is the smallest financial amount awarded, which is $100,000 over 2 years max. And that is 7 pages total for specific aims and research statement. Okay. Give you another sense of which one of these might be right for you. So the R01 is large. Usually it includes non-UCI colleagues on your team. And it usually involves a lot of planning. And an idea that, in my view, when I review R01s, it's kind of like a can't miss application, in that often you think, did these scholars already do this work? It's such a can't miss. The data that they plan to analyze, they might already have preliminary analysis for you. They might have shown you like a figure 1 that would appear in the article if you fund them. So these seem to me, when I read the ones that are successful, like a sure bet. Okay, you have a pretty established research question. It can be novel, but the key is that it's significant, well thought through, a large team. And again, you have preliminary data, so nobody thinks it's a risk in terms of giving you the money. Okay. Then you have an R21 that I think of more as like a mini R01. It's a small team. It could involve non-UCI colleagues, but often it might be one institution. The details are, if you read NIH website, it says it's a high risk, high reward grant, but I don't actually think that's true anymore. R21s are also things that are not really risky, okay? At least the ones that get funded. So it's not the like crazy idea. It's basically a mini R01 that has less ambition because you only have 2 years to do it. So it could be a reanalysis of existing data. It could be, again, requiring a little bit less person time to execute. And then you have the R03, which I think of more as a pilot project. You have a good idea that requires maybe a minimal amount of data cost and maybe a GSR for 1 or 2 quarters a year. And that's about it, because that's what $50,000 will buy you at UCI. So not that much person time, but the benefit is that you don't need that much lead time to prepare. Now, in terms of the lead time, I'm sure scholars can disagree about how much lead time you need. I would say for an R01, if you have a good idea and you're starting to develop it, 2 months before the deadline would be sufficient if you're disciplined. which means you have a team that you can really pull together. You have people working, rowing in the same direction. That could work. An R21, maybe a month and a half out, which basically is if you decide to write an R21 today for the June 16th deadline, you have 1.5 months. So it's not by accident that I'm giving this talk today, because the June 16th deadline is a month and a half from today, basically. And then a pilot project R03, maybe a month. But again, we can quibble about the different lead times, but just to give you a sense of what I think it takes. The due dates for the R01 are June, October, and February, but on the 5th. And then the same with R21 and R03, it's just on the 16th of June, October, and February. So those are the cycles. And on the details column, I just give you my editorial. I think that if you have never written an if you've never written an NIH grant before, I would say that writing an R01 as your first grant is a rather ambitious goal. It's possible. You might write a great one. But I think it's ambitious, just in terms of all the moving parts that are not the science, actually. The science, I think, is manageable, but it's all the other things. R21, again, I'd say, small team, GSR and postdoc, you can fund summer salary, some data. And then an R03, I would argue actually is pretty similar to the effort of an R21, but a lot less money. So you might see where I'm trying to suggest or nudge you. If you were to write your first grant to NIH, I'd say start with an R21. It's less effort than an R01 and more money than R03. And, but again, it depends on the individual and how well developed your idea is. But my experience is R03s are the same effort as an R21. I've written all mechanisms, and I welcome others' opinions as well. A couple other comments before I finish up. One is that I set up this talk so that it's a gentle introduction to NIH, because I really didn't want to scare you with the fact that an R01 is about 200 pages long. Okay, there's no way around that. It's a lot of time and energy, but I want to focus you on the fact that really the science is only 13 pages. And then everything else can be modified from other documents, tweaked. It takes time and energy, but it's not that intellectually taxing, to be honest. So don't let administrators tell you that it's impossible, okay? Sometimes you get administrators that are like, here's 50 forms. And I mean, it's not 50, it's maybe 15. And then I think that's exactly where faculty say, this is not possible. There's no way I could fill all this out. I have no idea where to start. What I wanted to do is start with the science and start with the realization that your peers who know your work will be reviewing you, okay? And then you want to speak to them. And then all of the other administrative stuff can follow, okay? The R21 and the R03 have less administrative overhead in terms of forms than does the R01. And there are many templates that you can work from, or examples that you can get from CPIP, from myself, or from pre-award administrators in your department. And my thoughts about these, again, is rather than feeling kind of mystified by the forms, use the resources you have. CPIP can help you. Examples from other grants that scored well could give you an idea of how to pitch yours. You can modify administrative templates from pre-award staff. And I encourage you to avail yourself of all those resources. And then focus on the science, and all these other things will flow logically. Here's a timeline. So let's imagine you've got 2 months before a submission date. There's a couple things to do. First, tell your pre-award staff that you plan to submit to NIH. Okay, you want to get them on board early. If you are not submitting through your department, CPIP has pre-award staff. Dan Paley, for example, is on that. So, but it depends. Again, there's a lot of good reasons you would want to submit through your department, but if for some reason you do not, CPIP would be happy to support you. And then you want to ensure there's an active program announcement. I give you some of the links there. You can always double check. These are the parent calls. So I tell you what to search just to make sure that NIH is still offering these general R01 and R21 and R3 announcements. And then solidify your research team, because making sure you have good sub-award contracts and budgets with non-UCI colleagues takes time. And so those are the things I would really start on, because they require the most, back and forth to get done. And then when you're between like 1 and 2 months, maybe around 1 month, you start circulating your very solid one-page specific aims. Okay, it's a one-page single-space document that should be circulated to your colleagues for feedback. You should have really solid aims. You could use CPIP resources to come up with a red team or mock study section review. We pay outside reviewers who are formally on study section to check if your specific aims are solid. Okay, we can also at that point get non-UCI documents from collaborators to help fill out your application. When you're around 3 weeks away, you want to have a good research statement, pretty solid draft. I'd say, again, 12 pages for an R01, 6 pages for an R21 or R03. And now you're working a lot more closely with pre-award staff on around 15 to 20 administrative documents that you can borrow from templates and examples from past submissions. When you're around 2 weeks away, SPA, Sponsored Projects Administration, will want to see it. They review it for ensuring that all of your documents meet NIH requirements. They don't really review the science. So that's good news for you, because you are free to continue to work on refining the scientific pitch up until the moment you submit. Okay, so I give SPA, make sure like all the documents have the right margins and font sizes and budget, all that stuff. But I continually modify the science up until the last week of the proposal being submitted. Okay? Then you submit. So I don't like submitting on the day of. It just makes me nervous. So I actually try to be done the day before. But do final checks, read through the whole PDF's compilation, and then you do not submit the grant. Sponsored Projects submits the grant. They ultimately click the submit button. So you want to make sure that you know the name of the person in Sponsored Projects that is going to submit for you, because they hold your fate in their hands. You also want to be in close contact with the pre-award staff to make sure that they're available on June 3rd, 4th, and 5th, or June 14th, 15th, and 16th. And so they know what's up too, because they are coordinating with SPA. That is a tight circle that you want to know very well and make sure it's running well so that you can avoid a heart attack on the day your submission is due and there might be an error or NIH kicks it back. All right. So I'm going to finish up and then hand it over to Candace and Greg. Some practical tips. I'll let them handle it, but basically these, reviewers have little time and less patience because they're reviewing a lot of grants. So think about what your high level pitch is. How can you get non-experts in your area to lean in and be excited about your work in a relatively short span of time? And then how do you bring home that idea? Repetition, I would argue, is actually encouraged. I'll let Greg and Candace talk about the components that they would evaluate, and I have my own opinions here. But really, you can use other successful grants to get examples on how to structure your own narrative. And we have examples at CPIP that we're happy to share. Final tips: don't procrastinate. Okay, don't submit an unpolished proposal, even if you can't make it on one cycle. It's better to submit a polished proposal 3 months later if you really don't make the timeline. The first NIH submission that you do is definitely the most work, but everyone thereafter is a lot easier because you can just take a lot of the things that you wrote on your first submission and go through. And you might ask why I wrote the 2nd through 25th. Well, that's where I am right now. I counted it today. So I'm on the 25th one, but it's fine because again, everyone after the first one is a lot easier. And I will close by saying that CPIP does give a financial incentive for those to write R01, R21, or R03 grants to the population dynamics branch. We will, to the extent we have funding still available, be able to offer up to $5,000 in research funds per submission per individual into NIH CHD PDB. I have some resources here I encourage you to avail yourself of them, including those at CPIP. Suzanne Ryan, who I put a picture of here, is also great. She's a review officer if you have questions about the study section. Dan Paley for pre-award, CPIP and Dan and myself for the scientific pieces that can really give you some examples of successful grants. And now I will hand it over to Greg and Candace about tips on what you would look for as a study section member. To you.
It's actually Candace and Greg.
Oh, Candace and Greg. Sorry. There you go.
Hi, everyone. This is great. Actually, seeing Suzanne's picture was kind of triggering because she just sent me an entire thing for the June SSPA panel, and I downloaded all of those applications, which Tim is right, are each about 200 pages each. And so I just wanted to spend a couple minutes giving you the perspective of a reviewer, so who you're speaking to when you put together your grant. And I think it was helpful to think of the tired and busy reviewer as a good frame for the person that you're trying to present your work to. And for those of you who haven't served on the study panel or haven't are less familiar with it, I think the structure, one element of the structure is really important to know. There is that list of all of the reviewers on the panel. So you'll see a list of about 15 people, but there are 2 reviewers on that panel who are going to read your proposal very closely and score that, and then present it to the larger group. So one of these reviewers who might not necessarily be in your specific discipline. So I'm a psychologist who sits on SSPA with economists, sociologists. So it's a really broad ranging kind of disciplines. I will be charged with presenting to the group 9 to 10 applications, justifying the score on all of the 5 criteria that I think Greg's going to cover some of them, and the overall impact of that. So the 2 reviewers will present their case, and then the rest of the committee, which has probably read the grant, but maybe not as closely, will come in and we'll try and everyone will eventually score it. So you want to make this as straightforward for the person who's reviewing your grant to present a summary of the significance of the innovation, right, of the methodological rigor for those. And I think this conversation started at the beginning of, Greg, I think you mentioned, bold it, tell the reviewer exactly why this proposal is innovative, right, and how. Personally, I love when an applicant can answer the if-then question. So if we find X, then it will mean Y, right? And if you can do that when you're writing your proposal. I want to take a second just to talk about overall impact, because this is something that has been really stressed to us in terms of scoring. So often when people get back their sheets, they'll look, and it's a bit of a mystery. The grants are scored on a scale of 1 to 9. Reviewers are really encouraged to use that entire scale. And a good grant is supposed to be a 5, right? So a good scientific proposal falls within that middle range. Now, how do you get into the 1s, 2s, and 3s, which is where you want your grant ultimately to be? A lot of it rests on this idea of the overall impact score, which takes these reviewer notes and scores for each of these 5 dimensions and weighs that and puts it together in overall impact. And the overall impact is the likelihood of the research to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the field, right? And so somewhere in that proposal, please tell me how this research is likely to exert a sustained and powerful influence on the field. Not just that it's a great study, not that it's just going to be interesting, but tell me exactly how that's going to happen. Because my job is going to be presenting to the rest of the panel your work, some of which might be outside of my field, and I have to make that argument. So think of the frazzled reviewer with chaos in their lives. Maybe I'm projecting too much of myself, kids hanging off you, running through the PDFs, and then trying to write the summary statement, and then going up in front of your peers, which could be anxiety provoking, and making this case. So help your reviewer friend out. I think the other thing, it's great, Tim, that you noted the page limits. And when I'm writing a grant, I'm trying to squish everything possible into those page limits. When I'm reading a grant, I often get a little irritated that people tried to squish everything they could into those page limits. And so this might sound a bit bizarre, but aesthetically, make your grant, each page bolding, spacing, use a little bit of extra space for that important figure. There's been many times where I've stood there and stared at a figure, unable to discern what exactly it represents. If you're going to use part of your page for a figure, walk the reviewer through it in a way that is crystal clear. And these are things that, you can get feedback from, early, ideally if you get your grant in early from your peers. I guess the last piece, I'll turn it over to Greg, who really knows what he's talking about. But my last piece of advice would be, Tim, you did a masterful job of presenting kind of all of the institutes and the study panels and how to think about mechanisms. This is not simple. This is a complicated structure. And so, ask your peers, ask your program officer, get the people locally who are there to help you with the other, 170 pages of your grant on board early. And there are really no stupid questions because the rules change frequently. These aren't things that we're supposed to just know. These are kind of idiosyncratic things about specific agencies. So just ask questions, any questions, draw on resources that are here locally, and then also that are at NIH. So with that, I will turn it over to Greg.
Thanks. And thanks to Tim for putting together such a wonderful presentation. I learned a lot, actually. It's been a while since I served on study section. So I'd say a few things. One is, as Tim mentioned, the study section is part of the Center for Scientific Review, which is totally distinct from the branches, the population dynamics branch, NIA, totally distinct, right? And so the people, the staff people in those substantive sections really have no influence whatsoever on the actual operation of the review process. But that, what motivates them is to deliver really good grant applications to the review panels and to get them funded, right? Because that's what makes them look good. That's what makes their branch look like it's engaging in really important research. So they're there to help you, and they will help you. I mean, they're eager to help with strategic decisions and kind of framing decisions for grant ideas that you have. So take advantage of that. But first, connect with us. Right, it's better to go local first before you try to connect with the program people, because there's a lot of local wisdom on the campus here, and take advantage of that. I think maybe I'm risk averse, but I always start more than 2 months before I have to submit a grant. I think of it as kind of an article in a number of ways. First of all, it takes a lot of time, and doing a really good grant, especially an R01, means you probably won't get one of the articles that you're hoping to get out. But that's kind of the price you pay. But also, think about the review process for a grant in a similar way to a review process for an article. With decent luck, you can get good reviewers for your grant, and you can get good reviewers for your article. And if you really nail a grant, or if you really nail an article, your chance of being successful are pretty high. So it's not, as Tim was mentioning, it's not NIH that's making these decisions. It's really the peer review panel. And be motivated by that, right? So it's really good people sitting around. It's not that they're kind of independently mailing in their reviews and they're not talking to one another. They talk to one another. And it is a great feature of the review panels, because someone can come in with a mistaken impression, an important mistaken impression of a part of your grant, and the conversation process will often correct that. And that's good. So it's a fair and motivating, not always satisfactory by any means, but it's a really strong kind of review process that you can go through. So if you really nail a good proposal, your chances of getting it funded, maybe not the first time, but with the resubmission, can be pretty substantial. Tim talked about child health for NICHD, but then it's really child health and development. But then that's pretty broad, and it's at the end of the day, it's really whatever the review panel thinks is cool. It's got to fit in general into the branch, but you can push these boundaries a bit if it's a really good idea and reviewers get excited about it, because reviewers don't care about it fitting into some narrow slot within a program. They just want cool ideas, and they want to fund the cool ideas. They don't want too many cool ideas in one grant, right? That's a problem. They're by and large very good top researchers, but they also are a bit conservative sometimes, especially working in a group. So it's good to have one really good idea, but if it's just a lot of new stuff, I think people tend to get nervous about that. I hate to tell people to kind of scale back their ambitions a bit, but make sure it's a cool idea, but don't kind of load up everything into a grant and expect people to be to understand it all and to be excited about it. So Candace talked about some of the criteria. They literally they're asked to rate significance, right? They're asked to rate innovation. And they do these bullet lists, right? So, imagine that your proposal is the 8th one that Candace is reading. She's put it off until toward the end. She's done.
Started today, Greg. I started today.
Okay, yeah. Okay, think of Tim and not Candace then. Tim probably starts early too. So do I. But some reviewers won't, and they'll be on their 4th proposal, and they'll turn to yours. So a little bit bleary-eyed, right? So on these kind of bulleted points, they somehow have to come up with a list of pros associated with innovation, associated with significance, right? And you should structure your proposal so that those elements are just blindingly obvious, right? And let me share my screen for a minute. This is I hope everyone can see that. This is a proposal for a big RCT, income RCT that we're doing. There's an innovation section. And we try to make these innovation points blindingly obvious. This will be the first large-scale U.S. experiment involving unconditional cancer transfers to poor families with infants, right? They can't miss that. We're going to employ neuroscience methods for measuring, it's in the context of no one's done that before, right? So you want to make that very obvious. All these kind of points, co-funding by a lot of philanthropic organizations, all the kind of points that make your proposal unique in terms of innovation, unique in terms of significance. Those are very important. Not only because the reviewers have to write that down, but they have to write it down because NIH values those things, right? So the case for your grant will rest on reviewers understanding why it's innovative, and especially why it's significant, why the impact is pretty high. So spoon feed all of that to reviewers because it'll help. So I guess that's it. We should just turn to questions for the last 15 minutes. That's going to be the best thing.
Floor is open.
Thanks so much. This was so helpful. I guess I want to go back to Tim's question that he raised at the beginning about like how healthy do these do NIH proposals need to be? And if I could just hear your thoughts, maybe Candace and Greg, about how healthy they need to be, that would, I think, really help me get a better clarity about fit.
So how healthy, I mean, how health focused, is that what you're saying?
Yes, exactly. How health focused.
Not very, in my experience. I mean, grants on child behavior problems, those kind of things are welcome. Child cognition. So it's not at all just health. It's a pretty, it's child health and human development, right? And human development opens up a big swath of things that most of you are concerned about anyway. So I wouldn't take the health part as very constraining.
I agree with that. So Naomi, I'm thinking of your work specifically in terms of crime, crime employment, reviewing for NIJ and then reviewing for NIH. You could swap many of those grants out. It's just responding to a specific call. And so I think you just have to kind of reorient yourself in terms of what the criteria that they're evaluating each of those are. The grant structure is going to look very different, but your work would fit well, in both places. So I don't think you need to feel excluded because you look at crime. You can make the case for crime as a health variable, which is a pretty easy one to make. So I think you should feel like you would find many homes for your work in NIH.
Hi guys, I have a question if no one else is going. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. And I was even in the NIH boot camp that UCI has, and this was good information on top of that. So I appreciate the time you guys dedicated to this. I had a question about the review committees because I submitted an R01 after that boot camp to a specific call in the Dental and Craniofacial Institute. So not NICHD. But then the proposal got pushed to like a physical health, like lifestyle and behavioral health sciences review committee. And all the reviews so there was like a real mismatch, I felt like, between the call, which came from the dental and cranial health people, and the review committee. And I didn't know, like, how should I have intervened before it went to the review committee to ask for a different committee, or?
Yeah, so this is a great question, Jenna, and this happened to me a few months ago, and it really annoyed me too, because you spend a lot of time pitching it to a certain audience, and then they switch the audience, and then they say, "Oh, so using Matchmaker at the outset is a good start. Contacting a review officer at that point and saying, hey, I'm going to write a cover letter that's going to recommend this and that study section because of these reasons. And by the way, it also fits with Matchmaker." You make that argument in advance. Now, the situation you're in now, they're going to say, well, it already went to one study section. Do you want to go with the devil you know or a new one? It depends on if you got scored or not. I actually wish I had not listened to the review officer the second time, because he said, oh, just keep it in the same place. And I was like, they're still going to not understand it and not care. So I wish I had just stuck with my guns a little bit and said, I'm going to make that advocate, I'm going to advocate for a better fit. So you and I can talk more specifically, or others can, chime in, but there's multiple points of attempted intervention. That said, NIH ultimately does make the decision about where to channel the grant. You can't override the review officer there.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I mean, I guess a more general question too is just like, would you suggest going to those specific calls or doing a more, because when I talked to the program officer, he was like, you can resubmit with revisions and we'll fund it based on the committee. So he was actually encouraging, but for future, right, should I look for specific calls? Do you get
I honestly, the funding lines for different agencies doesn't change in response to a call. So I have actually found that it's like the tail wagging the dog a little bit. If you chase a call, it depends if they have some money earmarked for a call, but usually they don't. And so it's just this call that says, and the reviewers looking at it don't care about the call. They have no idea. They're like, oh, you're really interested in dental health? So what? Right? So like, they don't care. And so then you're like, wait, who's responding to the call? Clearly not the review committee. So I actually have mixed feelings about the call. In fact, maybe I'm being clear. I actually think it's a little bit negative.
Okay. No, that's helpful. That's helpful. Thank you. Oh, I have one more piece of advice for new investigators if no one has a question. But I realized when I set up my ERA account, which is like, you need to have that to submit, I didn't fully submit all my information. I guess I just did it quickly one day or maybe like my grants person did it for me and I never went in and checked on it. And I realized about the day before I submitted the grant that because I never fully completed it, my early investigator status wasn't official, because you need to enter all your schooling information and every degree you have and the date of that degree, or else you won't be put into that pool. So just make sure you check your account and you have all that information in, or else it won't be kind of put into that separate pool where you get the higher funding or pay line.
Great, thank you, Jenna. Other questions?
I have another question if people don't mind. Talking more about the different mechanisms like the R03 and the R21 and the R01, like apart from, I guess, apart from the size, it feels like maybe, do they have a preference about you starting small and building up? And I say this because when I worked at the Vera Institute, I was under the impression you really had to like go through each of these ranks, like you couldn't skip one of them. But that was 15 years ago, and that was, at the Vera Institute. I don't know how much that really applies here. It sounded like you could really just pick and choose depending on what stage your project is at. Is that right?
I'll be brief, and then I'm sure Greg has some comments on this, or Candace. That is right in principle. You can submit to whichever mechanism makes sense. Review panels tend to be conservative though, right? But for that reason, that's why the early stage investigator gets a funding bump in terms of percentiles. Because what used to happen more frequently was, oh, here's an old established person. No doubt they can do it. They should get the R1 because they got 4 beforehand. Oh, look at this new faculty. Well, they're new. What's wrong with them? They're new, right? So it's this kind of totally tautological, annoying reasoning that NIH acknowledged and tries to redress with the early stage investigator bump. But that is only for R01s. So I should make that clear. The early stage investigator bump is not for R21s and R03s. That was actually a surprise to me when I scored just below the funding line and thought, oh, but I have the early stage investigator bump. They're like, no, that's only for the big grant. So in some ways, think about that in terms of ways that the institution is steering you to certain directions. Greg, thoughts? Candace?
Yeah, I would. Well, I would also say, you might think that the R03 and R21 panels would give a little bit of a scientific break to early career people, but my experience is that they don't. It's just impossible to overlook, shaky aspects of a proposal. So they handle it with this percentile change, right, and not expecting the review panel itself to make any sort of allowances for a career stage.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I would think of the selection of mechanism more as a fit to the project versus the trajectory of the person, right? So it's not that you have to come up through, this progression from a K to an R, to the R series, and match it that way. And also, that's absolutely right. The consideration of you're not supposed to consider early career stage in evaluating the science, and that gets done over here. So for that reason, if you're kind of on the border between kind of the R21 and the R01, you might just want to bump up. I think, so I'll add one other piece of advice, and maybe people might feel differently about this, but one of the, for each of these criteria, you have to list the strengths and the weaknesses. So reviewers are going to be looking for weaknesses in your grant, and as reviewers, that's what they look for anyway. So kind of avoid the habit of trying to hide or camouflage any weaknesses you might have. If there's kind of a weakness that you would recognize in reading this, address it in the grant, because that also helps in presenting the work. Because after the 2 reviewers present your work, there's going to be this open discussions and people are going to bring up these issues. So if you've already addressed it in the grant, it's much easier for the person presenting your work to say, oh, but they have a consultant that's going to do Y, or they have some preliminary data that shows feasibility of the method with this population. So think carefully, make a list of limitations that you have. Now, don't go through and address every one, but what are the big obvious ones? And I would include that in the grant as well.
Yeah, and in terms of, go ahead, Greg.
Well, I was going to talk about something a little bit different, so go ahead.
Just briefly, just a grantsmanship thing. You can point out some limitations, but make them, you can make them obvious, but make them small, right? Like, oh, there's a really big limitation. We're only studying 10 countries instead of 11, right? And so we don't know if it's going to generalize to the 11th country, but we'll look into it because we have some consultant from the 11th country, right? Something that's like, oh, really? That's a limit, but like if you print out a lot of red flags, clearly they'll be like, thank you for pointing out the fact that you shouldn't be funded in the first place. So, Greg?
So I'd say when you do the research plan, you can be, part of it's kind of engaging in this mutual fantasy exercise. When you get your data, it never works out the way that you think it will. And you can kind of talk about all the contingencies about problems that might come up. But I think a lot of grants are written, reviewers know that things happen, right? So if you get the data pretty much that you're expecting to, walk through the stages of what you're going to do to analyze it, do a power analysis, be very kind of straightforward in laying out all the stages of what your analysis is going to look like, rather than talking about all the uncertainty up front and, if this happens, then we're going to do this otherwise. So people will know that, as I say, that things happen, but they also want to be reassured that once you get the data worked out as best you can, that you can then go through all the rest of the steps, to come up with a really convincing analysis. So so think about that as well as, worrying about limitations and things happening. These are grants. So you're not committing yourself to do exactly what you say you're going to do. You're committing yourself to use the resources in the best way to get the job done and accomplish your goals, given everything that comes up.
For one last question. Anybody with the last question?
If I could ask a last question, thank you so much for putting this on, everybody. For those of us that are like at the beginning stages of, getting those grant ideas together, building the research team, I wonder if you could, it's all seems very overwhelming. Like, how do we know our ideas are good? At what point do you approach the program officer with your ideas? Doesn't need to have a fully fleshed out, embedded specific aims page before reaching out. And then I was wondering if you could give some tips about how to put together a good research team, especially applying as a PI, as a junior investigator.
So I would say, now that we're vaccinated, we can have an unmasked cup of coffee with you to talk about these things over at Pete's, right? It's really useful to have a specific conversation, given your interests, about what the next steps would be. It's hard to talk about this in a very generic kind of way, I would say. So, I'd welcome a conversation. I'm sure other people would as well, to kind of get you initially thinking about what the next steps in your proposal development strategy should be.
Yeah, my advice
agree.
was going to be start locally. And I think, Jenna mentioned the NIH boot camp on campus. And I think that's a really great resource to come in with with a cohort and have 4 to 6 months to kind of think about writing that first R, getting constant feedback, going through this, both the generics training, but then being led by people who've successfully submitted. So I would start locally, coffee with Greg, enrolling in the NIH boot camp, having conversations with people who've submitted.
Just from CPIP's perspective, we don't post templates or examples of past grants on the website, but those are things we can send individually for faculty under the condition that they're not disseminating those widely and they're using it for their own, thinking of an example and then that, because I feel like just seeing successful grants demystifies the process so much. And then once you have that, it's almost like, well, there's no, you have your own idea, you're your own person. So you clearly, go your own direction, but just seeing what that framework looks like can make it so much easier. So, we can happy to help with that, but I agree. Start at UCI. And then once you feel like, okay, I have a good sense of what I want to do, then maybe I'll engage the review officer about what, how to push forward. So great. We are out of time and this will be recorded. It is recorded, so it'll also be posted on CPIP, but thank you so much for attending. Thanks to Candace and Greg for their insight as well. And hopefully we'll be in touch.